In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a chilling murder shatters the peace. Victor Crane, a nosy journalist, is found stabbed by a locked greenhouse with no footprints in the mud. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets. A missing artist, a nervous wife, a loyal gardener, and hidden diamonds tied to a shadowy past. As whispers of smuggling and betrayal surface, the ancient willow tree stands as the silent witness, holding the key to a truth that will shock the village. Can Miss Marple decode its secrets before the killer slips away? Chapter 1. The Village of St. Mary Mead. The morning sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, a village so quintessentially English that it seemed to exist outside the rush of time. Its thatched cottages, their gardens ablaze with hollyhocks and delphiniums, lined the single winding street that led to the church, where the vicar's sermons were as predictable as the chiming of the ancient clock. In her modest house, with its neatly trimmed hedges and climbing roses, Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite wicker chair, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome. A ball of soft grey wool rested in her lap, and beside her, on a small table, stood a cup of Earl Grey, its steam curling into the warm July air. Miss Marple's garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could observe the world without being observed. From her vantage point, she could see the comings and goings of the village. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, bustling to the shop with her usual air of self-importance. Young Tommy Pierce, delivering newspapers with a whistle that was more enthusiasm than tune. And, on this particular morning, a knot of villagers gathered near the gate of Willow Cottage, their voices low but animated. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, noted the scene with interest. Gossip, she knew, was the lifeblood of St. Mary Mead, and Willow Cottage had provided a fresh vein. The cottage, a charming if slightly dilapidated affair with ivy-clad walls, had been empty for years until Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Redding arrived from London 6 weeks ago. He was a tall, quiet man in his 40s, with a scholarly stoop and a habit of sketching in the orchard, his easel a fixture under the sprawling willow tree that gave the cottage its name. She was younger, perhaps 30, with auburn hair that caught the light like polished copper and a restless energy that seemed out of place in the village's languid pace. The Reddings were polite but distant, attending church but declining invitations to tea, which only fueled speculation. Some said they were wealthy, others that they were hiding something, and all agreed that the locked greenhouse at the edge of their garden was peculiar indeed. Miss Marple, who had a knack for noticing what others overlooked, had already formed her own impressions. She had seen Mrs. Redding at dusk, pacing the garden paths with a distracted air, her hands twisting a silk scarf as if it were a lifeline. Mr. Redding, meanwhile, spent hours sketching the willow tree, his eyes fixed on its drooping branches with an intensity that suggested more than artistic devotion. And then there was the greenhouse, its glass panes clouded with grime, its heavy padlock glinting in the sun. No one, not even old Tom, the gardener, was permitted inside, which struck Miss Marple as curious for a couple so recently settled. As she sipped her tea, her maid, Florence, appeared at the garden gate, her round face flushed with excitement. "Oh, miss, you'll never believe it," she exclaimed, clutching her apron. "There's been a dreadful to-do at Willow Cottage. They found a body in the garden, right by that queer greenhouse. A man, stabbed clean through, they say, and dead as can be." Miss Marple set her cup down carefully, her mind already turning. "Indeed, Florence," she said, her voice calm but her eyes bright with curiosity. "Who was he? Do we know?" "They're saying it's a stranger, miss. Some fellow from London. The police are there now, and half the village besides." Florence paused, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Redding's in a state, and Mr. Redding. Well, no one's seen him since yesterday. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their gentle click. A body in the garden, a missing husband, and a locked greenhouse, St. Mary Mead, it seemed, had been stirred from its slumber. She rose, folding her knitting into a wicker basket. "I think, Florence," she said, "I shall take a walk to Willow Cottage. The roses there are said to be quite fine this year." But as she stepped onto the path, her thoughts were not on roses. Murder, she reflected, had a way of revealing secrets, and the garden at Willow Cottage, with its silent willow and shuttered greenhouse, seemed to hold more than its share. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The sun had climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the lane to Willow Cottage. By noon, the village was alive with a subdued hum, the kind that follows a tragedy too shocking to be ignored, yet too delicate for open chatter. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, walked with a measured step toward the cottage, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. The villagers, gathered in small clusters, parted to let her pass, their whispers trailing her like a soft breeze. They knew better than to underestimate the elderly spinster with her gentle smile and keen eyes. Miss Marple, after all, had a way of seeing through the fog of human folly. Willow Cottage stood at the end of the lane, its thatched roof gleaming under the midday light. The garden, usually a picture of orderly beauty with its lavender borders and rose trellises, was now a stage for chaos. Policemen in dark uniforms moved with purposeful strides, their boots sinking into the damp earth. A small crowd lingered. Beyond the low stone wall, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her gaze sweeping the scene. The greenhouse, squat and weathered, stood at the far end of the garden, its clouded glass glinting dully. Beside it, a tarpaulin had been hastily erected, shielding something or someone from view. Inspector Craddock, a young man with a square jaw and a reputation for thoroughness, spotted Miss Marple and approached with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I was hoping you might come. You've a knack for these things, haven't you?" His tone held a hint of deference, though his eyes betrayed the strain of a case already proving troublesome. "I was merely passing by, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild, but her eyes sharp as they took in the scene. "A dreadful business, I hear. May I ask what happened?" Craddock gestured toward the greenhouse. "A man was found dead this morning, stabbed in the chest. We've identified him as Victor Crane, a journalist from London. Not the sort you'd expect in St. Mary Mead, but he was here, and now he's dead. The body's by the greenhouse door, and it's a queer setup. I'll tell you that." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Queer, you say? In what way?" "Come see for yourself," Craddock said, leading her through the garden. The villagers watched, their murmurs fading as the elderly lady and the inspector passed the rose beds, where petals lay scattered like confetti after the morning's commotion. The greenhouse loomed closer, its padlocked door a stark contrast to the open beauty of the garden. Beneath the tarpaulin, partially visible, lay the body of a man, his face pale and his eyes fixed in a glassy stare. A dark stain spread across his shirt, and beside him a shattered lantern lay in the mud, its glass fragments catching the light like scattered jewels. Miss Marple knelt slightly, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a botanist examining a rare specimen. The ground around the body was soft, churned by recent rain, yet there were no footprints leading to or from the corpse. The greenhouse door, heavy and rusted, bore no signs of tampering, its padlock intact. Inside, through the murky glass, she could just make out rows of plants, their leaves pressing against the panes as if straining to escape. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sweeter, almost cloying, orchids perhaps, or something more exotic. No footprints, Craddock said, following her gaze. That's the odd part. The ground's soft enough to hold a mark, but there's nothing. It's as if the killer dropped from the sky or vanished into thin air. Miss Marple straightened, her lips pursed. Or perhaps, she said softly, they were cleverer than that. Her eyes drifted to the willow tree, its long branches swaying gently in the breeze, their tips brushing the earth near the greenhouse. A faint scratch on its trunk caught her attention, a hairline mark no wider than a knitting needle. She said nothing, but her mind filed it away, a small piece in the puzzle taking shape. Craddock, meanwhile, was recounting what he knew. Crane was last seen alive 2 days ago, according to Mrs. Redding. He came to interview her husband about his artwork, something about a feature in a London magazine. She says he left before dusk, but old Tom, the gardener, claims he saw Crane snooping around the greenhouse that evening, carrying that lantern. He pointed to the broken glass. We found Crane's notebook in his pocket, but it's mostly scribbles, nothing clear enough to point to a motive. And then there's Mr. Redding. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Still missing, I take it. Craddock nodded, his jaw tightening. Not a trace since yesterday. The villagers say he was in the orchard all afternoon, sketching as usual, but no one saw him leave. His wife's in a state, says he'd never hurt a fly, but he trailed off, his skepticism clear. Mrs. Redding stood near the cottage door, her auburn hair dishevelled, her hands clasped tightly around a handkerchief. She was a striking figure, even in distress, her green eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. Miss Marple approached, her demeanour as soothing as a vicar's wife offering tea. My dear, she said gently, this must be a terrible shock. Would you mind telling me a little about Mr. Crane's visit? Mrs. Redding's lips trembled, but she steadied herself. He came to see Lawrence, she said, her voice low. He was writing about artists living in the countryside, or so he said. They talked in the parlour for an hour, and then he left. I didn't see him after that. Her eyes darted to the greenhouse, then away, as if the sight of it pained her. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind alert. And your husband? He was in the orchard yesterday, I believe. Yes, Mrs. Redding said quickly. He's been painting the willow tree for weeks. He says the light there is special. Her voice faltered, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. He wouldn't have done this, Miss Marple. He's not that kind of man. Of course, Miss Marple said, patting her arm, but her eyes lingered on Mrs. Redding's hands, noting the faint tremble, the way her fingers twisted the handkerchief into knots. She recalled the photograph she had seen in the Reddings' parlour, a younger Mrs. Redding with a man whose face was obscured, a detail that now seemed more significant than it had at the time. As she stepped away, Inspector Craddock joined her, his notebook open. We're searching the orchard now, he said. Redding's easel is still there, half covered in mud, but no sign of him. If he's run off, it doesn't look good. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the willow tree, its branches casting long shadows across the garden. Running, she said thoughtfully, is not always a sign of guilt, Inspector. Sometimes it's a sign of fear. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Have you looked closely at the lantern? The glass, I mean. Craddock frowned, then called over a constable who retrieved the shattered pieces. The lantern's frame was bent, its glass scattered in a rough circle, but one shard, larger than the rest, bore a faint smear of what looked like paint, green, vivid, and out of place in the muddy earth. Odd, Craddock muttered. Crane wasn't carrying paint, and Redding's easel is nowhere near here. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was racing. The greenhouse, the lantern, the willow tree, each was a thread in a tapestry she could not yet fully see. She glanced at the crowd beyond the gate, where Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was holding court, her voice carrying snippets of speculation. Heard they argued, Crane and Mr. Redding, she was saying. Something about money, or so Tom said. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with old Tom, whose role as gardener gave him a front-row seat to the Reddings' lives. For now, she turned her attention back to the greenhouse. Its locked door and clouded glass seemed to mock the investigation, guarding secrets that refused to be revealed. She stepped closer, peering through a small, clear patch in the glass. Inside, she saw not only orchids but strange, spiky plants with leaves that seemed almost predatory, their colours unnatural in the dim light. Mrs. Redding is particular about her plants, Craddock said, following her gaze. Won't let anyone near them. Says they're rare. Brought from some expedition her husband funded. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. Rare plants, she said softly, can be worth more than gold, Inspector. And people will do strange things for what they value. She turned away, her eyes lingering on the willow tree, its branches swaying as if whispering to the wind. I think, she added, I shall return tomorrow. The garden, you see, has a way of speaking, if one knows how to listen. As she walked back to her cottage, the village settling into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of details. The footprintless mud, the scratched trunk, the green paint on the lantern's glass. St. Mary Mead was a place of patterns, she knew, and murder, like a dropped stitch, always disrupted the design. It was only a matter of time, she thought, before the pattern revealed itself, and the silent witness in the garden spoke at last. Chapter 3. The Missing Husband. The dusk settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft grey veil, muting the vibrant greens of the village gardens and casting long shadows across the cobbled lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour, the fire crackling softly in the grate, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she worked on a delicate lace scarf. The room was a haven of order. The polished mahogany table, the vase of fresh-cut lavender, the ticking of the mantel clock. Yet her thoughts were far from tranquil, weaving through the tangled threads of the murder at Willow Cottage. The absence of Lawrence Redding, the elusive artist, was a knot she could not yet unravel, and Miss Marple knew that a missing man was often the key to a mystery, or a distraction from it. The village had buzzed all day with speculation. By afternoon, the news of Victor Crane's death had spread beyond St. Mary Mead, drawing a handful of reporters from London who loitered near the post office, their notebooks open and their questions sharp. Inspector Craddock, harried but methodical, had spent the day interviewing villagers, but no one had seen Redding since the previous morning, when he was spotted in the orchard, his easel propped beneath the willow tree. His disappearance, coupled with the gossip of a heated exchange with Crane days earlier, had painted him as the prime suspect in the eyes of many. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily swayed by village chatter. She had learned long ago that appearances could be as deceptive as a shadow in a storm. She set her knitting aside and reached for the cup of cocoa Florence had left on the table. The warmth of the cup steadied her as she considered the facts. Crane, a journalist with a nose for scandal, had been stabbed by the greenhouse, a place Mrs. Redding guarded with almost obsessive care. The lack of footprints suggested cunning, and the green paint on the shattered lantern hinted at something more deliberate than a chance encounter. And then there was Redding himself, gone, leaving behind an easel, a half-finished sketch, and a wife whose distress seemed tinged with something unspoken. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. People, she reflected, often ran from what they feared, but fear could stem from guilt, love, or something entirely unexpected. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Florence ushered in Inspector Craddock, his face etched with fatigue, but his manner brisk. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into the armchair she indicated. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I thought you might like to know what we've found, or rather, what we haven't." Not at all, Inspector, she replied, her voice as gentle as the glow of the firelight. I was just thinking about poor Mr. Crane. Have you any news of Mr. Redding? Craddock shook his head. Not a trace. We searched the orchard again this afternoon and found his easel, as I mentioned. But it's a mess. Mud smeared across the canvas, the sketch barely recognizable. It's of the willow tree, or what's left of it. Looks like he abandoned it in a hurry. We've got men checking the roads out of the village, and I've sent a wire to London in case he's gone there. But it's as if he's vanished into thin air. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her cup. Vanished, she murmured. Or perhaps he's hiding in plain sight. Tell me, Inspector, what do we know of Mr. Crane's purpose here? A journalist, you said, but not the sort to write about rural artists without reason. Craddock flipped open his notebook. Victor Crane was a muckraker, plain and simple. Worked for one of those London rags that thrive on scandal, affairs, fraud, the dirtier the better. His last few articles were about a smuggling ring, something to do with rare goods passing through respectable businesses. He'd been digging into a botanist named Edward Langley, who disappeared a few years back after some shady dealings. Crane was here supposedly to interview Redding, but I'm starting to think that was a pretext. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. Edward Langley, she said softly. An unusual name to crop up in St. Mary Mead. And Mrs. Redding, did she mention any connection to this man? Not a word, Craddock said, his brow furrowing. She's sticking to her story. Crane came, talked to her husband, and left. She's shaken, no doubt, but there's something she's not saying. I can feel it. Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to the photograph she had glimpsed in the Reddings' parlour. A younger Mrs. Redding with a man whose face was half hidden. Could it be Langley? She made a mental note to inquire further, but delicately, as one might probe a fragile stitch. And the greenhouse? She asked. Have you learned anything more about its contents? Craddock leaned forward, his voice lowering. Mrs. Redding says it's full of rare orchids, gifts from her husband's travels. She's adamant no one's allowed inside, not even old Tom. Says the plants are sensitive to disturbance. I've got a man looking into it, but without a warrant, we can't force the lock. It's odd though. Why lock a greenhouse so tightly unless there's something to hide? Indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. A locked door always suggests a secret, but not always the one we expect. She paused, her eyes drifting to the window, where the last light of day painted the garden in shades of violet. Have you spoken to old Tom again? Gardeners, you know, see more than most. They're like the furniture, always there, but rarely noticed. Craddock smiled faintly. You're right about that. Tom's cagey, but he swears he saw Crane by the greenhouse 2 nights ago, poking around with that lantern. Said he told him to clear off, and Crane just laughed. I'm seeing him again tomorrow. He's loyal to the Reddings, though. Might be covering for them. Miss Marple's lips curved in a small smile. Loyalty, she said, can be a powerful motive, Inspector. It can blind a man, or drive him to act. She set her cup down and rose, smoothing her skirt. I think I shall pay a call on Mrs. Redding tomorrow. A little sympathy, you know, can loosen tongues where questions fail. Craddock stood, his expression a mix of amusement and respect. I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple, but I'm glad you're on the case. If you hear anything, you'll let me know. Of course, she replied, her eyes twinkling. But I suspect the garden itself may have more to say than any of us yet realise. After Craddock left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind as busy as her needles. She thought of the willow tree, its branches drooping like a curtain over the orchard, and the scratch on its trunk, a detail so small it might have been overlooked by anyone less observant. She thought of Crane, his lantern, and the green paint that seemed to belong nowhere in the scene. And she thought of Mrs. Redding, whose beauty and nervousness suggested a woman carrying a burden heavier than grief. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for Willow Cottage, her straw hat tilted against the sun. The village was quieter now, the reporters having retreated to file their stories, but the air still hummed with tension. She found Mrs. Redding in the drawing room, seated by a window overlooking the garden. The room was elegantly furnished, with brocade curtains and a walnut writing desk, but it felt oddly impersonal, as if the Reddings had not yet made it their own. Mrs. Redding looked up, her face pale but composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Miss Marple," she said, rising, "how kind of you to come. I'm afraid I'm not much company today." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with the ease of an old friend. "I only wanted to see how you're managing. Such a dreadful thing, and with Mr. Redding away, it must be terribly lonely." Mrs. Redding's eyes flickered, but she managed a faint smile. "Lawrence will be back soon, I'm sure. He needed some time to think, that's all. This business with Mr. Crane, it's upset him terribly." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "Of course. And Mr. Crane's visit, did it upset him as well? I understand he was quite persistent." Mrs. Redding hesitated, her fingers tightening on the arm of her chair. "He was curious," she said at last, "more than I expected for a simple article. He asked about Lawrence's paintings, but also about our life in London, our travels. It felt intrusive." "I see," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but her mind sharp. She glanced at the mantelpiece, where the photograph still stood. "You've travelled a great deal, haven't you? I noticed that charming picture. Such a lovely memory, I'm sure." Mrs. Redding's face stiffened, and she rose abruptly, moving to the mantel as if to shield the photograph. "Oh, that's an old thing," she said, her voice too bright. "Just a friend from years ago. I keep it for sentiment." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes missed nothing. The way Mrs. Redding's hand lingered on the frame, the slight tremor in her voice. She changed the subject, chatting lightly about the village flower show, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The photograph, the greenhouse, the missing husband, each was a piece of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to find how they fit. As she left Willow Cottage, she paused by the orchard, where the willow tree stood sentinel. The easel was gone now, taken by the police, but the ground beneath the tree was still disturbed, the mud churned as if by hurried feet. She bent down, her eyes catching a glint in the grass. A tiny metal button, engraved with a faint design, half buried in the earth. She slipped it into her pocket, her mind turning to old Tom, the gardener, whose loyalty might be more complicated than it seemed. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the lace scarf growing under her needles. The button, the scratch on the willow, the green paint, they were clues, small but insistent, like the first notes of a melody. Lawrence Redding's absence was a shadow over the case, but Miss Marple suspected the truth lay not in where he had gone, but in what he had left behind. And somewhere, in the silent garden, the willow tree stood watch, its branches hiding secrets she was determined to uncover. Chapter 4. The Gardener's Tale. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's cottages and lending an air of mystery to the hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a tweed coat against the damp, made her way along the lane to Willow Cottage, her steps brisk but unhurried. The village was quieter now, the initial shock of Victor Crane's murder settling into a nervous hum, like the drone of bees before a storm. Miss Marple's mind, however, was as clear as the bell that tolled from the church tower, each detail of the case slotting into place like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, yet to reveal its full picture. Old Tom, the Reddings' gardener, was her destination. A man of few words and weathered hands, he had worked at Willow Cottage for years, long before the Reddings arrived, tending its roses and fruit trees with a devotion that bordered on reverence. Miss Marple had always found gardeners to be a peculiar breed, observers by nature, their eyes trained on the slow rhythms of the earth, yet often privy to secrets their employers scarcely noticed. If anyone knew more about the night of the murder, she reasoned, it would be Tom. She found him in the orchard, near the willow tree that had become a silent fixture in her thoughts. He was pruning a row of apple trees, his shears snipping with mechanical precision, his face half hidden under a battered cap. The willow loomed behind him, its branches drooping like a mourner's veil, and Miss Marple noted again the faint scratch on its trunk, now more visible in the morning light. The orchard was peaceful, save for the distant hum of a police car leaving the cottage, but the air carried a tension that matched the gardener's stiff posture. "Good morning, Tom," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as a neighbour offering jam. "I see you're keeping the orchard in fine shape, despite all this trouble." Old Tom glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly, though he tipped his cap politely. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice rough as the bark he tended. "Trouble don't stop the trees from growing, more's the pity." She smiled, settling onto a nearby bench as if for a casual chat. "Quite right. A garden goes on, doesn't it? No matter what happens. I suppose you've seen a great deal here, working for the Reddings." Tom returned to his pruning, his movements deliberate. "I see what needs seeing. Don't much care for town folk and their ways. But Mr. and Mrs. Redding, they're decent enough. Pay on time. Don't meddle with my work." Miss Marple's eyes followed his hands, noting the calluses, the faint tremor that betrayed age, or perhaps something more. "And that poor Mr. Crane," she said gently. "You saw him, I hear, the night before he was found. By the greenhouse, wasn't it?" Tom's shears paused, just for a moment, before resuming their steady clip. I told the inspector. Nosy fellow, that Crane, poking round the greenhouse with a lantern like he owned the place. I told him to clear off. Didn't like his laugh. Sharp like a fox." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her mind was alert. "A lantern, you say? The one they found broken, I suppose. Did he seem to be looking for something in particular?" Tom shrugged, his eyes fixed on the tree. "Didn't say, and I didn't ask. Just wanted him gone. Mrs. Redding's particular about that greenhouse. Her orchids, you know. Rare things, she says. Don't like strangers near 'em." "Orchids," Miss Marple murmured, as if the word were new to her. "They must be quite valuable to warrant such care. Do you ever tend them, Tom?" He shook his head, a touch too quickly. "Never been inside. She's got her own key. Keeps it locked tight. Says the plants need special conditions. I stick to the roses and the fruit trees." He gestured to the orchard, but Miss Marple noticed his gaze flicker toward the greenhouse, its clouded glass barely visible through the trees. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but probing. "It must be difficult, working so close to such a mystery. That greenhouse locked so tightly. It makes one wonder what's inside, doesn't it? More than orchids, perhaps." Tom's face tightened, and he set his shears down, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Don't know nothing about that, miss. I do my job, that's all. Mrs. Redding's a good mistress, and Mr. Redding, he's a quiet sort, but kind. Shame he's gone off like this. Makes folks think the worst." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was as sharp as the shears at Tom's side. "Indeed," she said. "People do jump to conclusions. But you've been here longer than the Reddings, haven't you? You must know the garden better than anyone. Did you notice anything unusual that night, Tom? Anything at all?" He hesitated, his fingers twitching as if itching to pick up the shears again. "Nothing worth telling," he said at last. "Just Crane and his lantern, and the rain starting up. I went home after that, to my cottage down the lane. Didn't see no one else." Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. "Of course. You're a busy man, Tom, with all this to tend. But if you do recall anything, you'll tell the inspector, won't you? Or perhaps me. if it's easier. Sometimes the smallest things matter. Tom grunted, returning to his work, but Miss Marple sensed a wariness in him, like a deer catching a scent on the wind. She rose, smoothing her coat, and took a slow turn around the orchard, her eyes lingering on the willow tree. The button she had found yesterday, with its faint engraving, was still in her pocket, and she wondered if it might belong to Tom's worn jacket, though she saw no missing buttons today. She paused by the tree, her fingers brushing the scratch on its trunk. It was deeper than she'd first thought, as if something heavy had grazed it, a tool, perhaps, or something dragged in haste. As she walked back to the village, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the greenhouse. Orchids, Tom had said, but his hesitation suggested more. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once described how rare plants could be used to smuggle goods, their shipments crossing borders with little scrutiny. The idea seemed fanciful for St. Mary Mead, yet the locked greenhouse and Crane's snooping hinted at something beyond the ordinary. That afternoon, she visited the village library, a small room above the post office where Miss Hartnell, the librarian, kept a meticulous record of every book borrowed. Miss Marple, under the pretense of seeking a gardening manual, asked if any books on orchids had been requested recently. Miss Hartnell, eager to share, mentioned that Mr. Redding had borrowed a volume on tropical plants some months ago, though he'd returned it promptly. Not the sort of thing you'd expect from an artist, she added, her tone implying a wealth of suspicion. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind turning to the photograph in the Reddings' parlour. The man beside Mrs. Redding, half hidden, was a shadow from her past, and Miss Marple suspected his identity might hold the key to Crane's interest. She resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock again, to learn if Crane's notebook had revealed anything new. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat in her garden, the air heavy with the scent of honeysuckle. She drew the button from her pocket, turning it over in her fingers. It was small, unremarkable, yet it felt like a clue, a tiny thread in the tapestry of the case. The greenhouse, the willow, the missing husband, each was a piece of the puzzle, but it was old Tom's guarded manner that lingered in her thoughts. Loyalty, she knew, could make a man silent, but it could also make him act, and she wondered just how far Tom's devotion to the Reddings might extend. The church clock struck 7, and Miss Marple tucked the button away, her eyes drifting to the stars emerging above. The garden at Willow Cottage, she thought, was more than a backdrop to murder. It was a witness, its secrets hidden in the earth and the branches, and she, with her quiet persistence, would coax them into the light. Chapter 5. A Shadow from the Past. The late morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's parlour, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. She sat in her favourite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, her knitting needles idle for once as she pored over a small notebook, not her own, but one borrowed from Inspector Craddock, containing the scribbled notes of the late Victor Crane. The pages were a jumble of shorthand, names, and cryptic phrases, but one name stood out, underlined in heavy ink: E. Langley. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she traced the letters with a fingertip, her mind weaving connections as deftly as she wove her intricate scarves. The photograph in the Reddings' parlour, the locked greenhouse, and now this name. Each was a thread in a tapestry that was beginning to take shape. St. Mary Mead was quieter today, the initial frenzy of the murder giving way to a subdued unease. The villagers went about their routines. Mrs. Price sorting letters at the post office, Tommy Pierce delivering milk with his usual clatter, but their conversations were hushed, their glances darting toward Willow Cottage. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be swayed by the villagers' mood. She had learned long ago that the truth often lay in the shadows, in the things people overlooked or chose not to see. Craddock had shared more details over breakfast at the vicarage, where he'd come to update the vicar and, by extension, Miss Marple. Crane's articles, published in a sensational London paper, had exposed a smuggling ring dealing in rare plants, using legitimate horticultural trade as a cover. Edward Langley, a botanist with a tarnished reputation, was named as a key figure, though he had vanished 3 years ago after a scandal involving stolen specimens from a South American expedition. Crane's note suggested he was closing in on Langley's trail, and his presence in St. Mary Mead was no coincidence. He must have thought the Reddings were connected, Craddock had said, his brow furrowed. But Mrs. Redding swears she barely knew Crane, and Redding's still missing. Miss Marple had nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. The photograph she had seen, a younger Mrs. Redding beside a man whose face was obscured, loomed large in her thoughts. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Redding again, this time with a touch more directness, though cloaked in her usual gentle manner. She set out for Willow Cottage just before noon, her straw hat shading her eyes against the sun. The garden was quieter now, the police presence reduced to a single constable stationed by the gate. The greenhouse stood as before, its locked door a silent challenge, its clouded panes concealing whatever secrets lay within. Mrs. Redding was in the drawing room, seated by the same window, her auburn hair pinned loosely, her hands fidgeting with a silver bracelet. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her green eyes wary but softened by exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she said, rising with a forced smile. "You're too kind to visit again. I'm afraid I've little to offer today. My nerves are quite frayed." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with a sympathetic nod. "It's only natural. Such a dreadful ordeal. And with Mr. Redding still away. Have you heard from him at all?" Mrs. Redding shook her head, her fingers tightening on the bracelet. "Not a word. I keep hoping he'll send a message, but he's so private, you see. He hates being drawn into things." Her voice trembled, and she looked away, toward the garden where the willow tree swayed gently. Miss Marple's eyes followed hers, noting the view of the orchard through the window. "He must find great solace in his painting," she said softly. "That willow tree. It's quite striking, isn't it? I can see why he'd choose it as a subject." Mrs. Redding nodded, a flicker of pride in her expression. "He says it captures the light like nothing else. He's been sketching it for weeks, trying to get it just right." Miss Marple smiled, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "And you, my dear, do you share his love of nature? Those orchids in the greenhouse, for instance. They must be quite a passion." The change in Mrs. Redding was subtle but unmistakable, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, a quick glance toward the mantel where the photograph stood. "They're a hobby," she said, her voice careful. "Lawrence brought them back from his travels. They're delicate, you know, and need constant care." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes drifting to the photograph. "It's wonderful to have such treasures from one's past. That picture there, it's charming. A friend from your London days, perhaps." Mrs. Redding's hand froze on her bracelet, and for a moment her composure wavered. "Just an old acquaintance," she said, her voice tight. "Someone I knew before Lawrence. It's nothing important." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was alight. She recalled Crane's notebook, the name E. Langley scrawled with such insistence. "I suppose," she said, her tone musing, "that a journalist like Mr. Crane might have been interested in such acquaintances. They do love to dig into the past, don't they?" Mrs. Redding's eyes met hers, and for a moment Miss Marple saw a flash of fear, quickly masked. "He asked too many questions," she said, almost to herself. "About Lawrence, about me, about things that didn't concern him. I told him to leave us alone." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but probing. "And did he, my dear? Or did he come back, perhaps to the greenhouse, looking for something more?" Mrs. Redding's face paled, and she rose abruptly, crossing to the window as if to escape the question. "I don't know what he wanted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want Lawrence back. This nightmare, it's too much." Miss Marple rose, patting her arm with a grandmotherly air. "Of course, my dear. You must rest. But if you remember anything at all, you'll tell the inspector, won't you? Or perhaps me, if it's easier." She paused, her eyes soft but searching. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it? Mrs. Redding nodded, her gaze fixed on the garden, and Miss Marple took her leave, her mind buzzing with new insights. The photograph, she was certain, held the key to Crane's interest, and Mrs. Redding's evasiveness only deepened her suspicion. As she passed the greenhouse, she glanced at its locked door, wondering what secrets lay hidden among the orchids. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Craddock in the vicarage garden, where the scent of roses mingled with the tang of freshly cut grass. He had received a telegram from London. Lawrence Redding had been sighted near a dockside warehouse, a place known for black market dealings. "We're sending men to bring him in," Craddock said, his voice grim. "If he's mixed up in something shady, it might explain Crane's murder." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps," she said. "But I wonder, Inspector, if Mr. Redding is running from guilt or from fear. And I wonder if Mrs. Redding knows more than she's saying. That photograph in their parlour, have you looked at it closely?" Craddock frowned. "Not yet. Should I?" "I think it might be worth a glance," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "And the greenhouse, Inspector. I really think you must find a way inside. Orchids are lovely, but they can hide more than beauty." As she walked home, the button from the orchard still in her pocket, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Edward Langley, a botanist, a smuggler, a man who had vanished, yet his shadow seemed to linger over Willow Cottage. She recalled a village girl, years ago, who had hidden letters from a lover in a hollow tree, thinking them safe from prying eyes. The willow, with its drooping branches and scratched trunk, might be hiding something similar, she thought. A secret not of love, but of something far darker. Back in her parlour, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the lace scarf growing under her deft fingers. The photograph, the greenhouse, the name in Crane's notebook, each was a clue, a whisper from the past. And somewhere, in the silent garden, the willow tree stood watch, its branches heavy with secrets she was determined to unravel. Chapter 6. The Locked Door. The afternoon light bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and casting long shadows across the meadows. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, sat on a bench in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a delicate lace shawl. The air was fragrant with the scent of late-blooming roses, but her thoughts were far from the tranquil beauty of her surroundings. The murder of Victor Crane, the missing Lawrence Redding, and the enigmatic greenhouse at Willow Cottage consumed her mind, each detail a thread in a pattern she was beginning to discern. Inspector Craddock had telephoned that morning with news that stirred the village's quiet rhythm. A warrant had been secured to open the greenhouse. The discovery of Crane's notebook, with its references to smuggling and the name E. Langley, had convinced the magistrate that the locked structure might hold clues to the journalist's death. Miss Marple, invited to observe as an unofficial consultant, a role Craddock offered with a mix of respect and amusement, made her way to Willow Cottage, her steps steady but her eyes alert. The cottage garden was a hive of activity, though more subdued than in the days immediately following the murder. A constable stood by the gate, keeping curious villagers at bay, while Craddock and two officers prepared to breach the greenhouse. Mrs. Redding stood on the cottage steps, her auburn hair catching the light, her face a mask of apprehension. She clutched a shawl around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the greenhouse as if it were a Pandora's box about to be opened. "Miss Marple," Craddock greeted her, his voice low but brisk. "I'm glad you're here. We're about to go in, and I've a feeling this might answer some questions, or raise new ones." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her gaze sharp. "A locked door, Inspector, always promises something worth finding. I do hope you'll be careful." Craddock gave a wry smile and signalled to the constable, who produced a heavy bolt cutter. The padlock on the greenhouse door, rusted but sturdy, gave way with a sharp snap, and the door creaked open, releasing a wave of humid air thick with the scent of earth and something sweeter, almost intoxicating. The officers stepped inside, their torches cutting through the dim interior, and Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her eyes taking in every detail. The greenhouse was a jungle of green, its shelves lined with rows of orchids in full bloom, their petals vibrant in shades of violet, crimson, and creamy white. Some were delicate, their roots suspended in glass containers, while others were robust, their leaves thick and glossy. The air was heavy with moisture, the glass walls fogged with condensation. But it was not the orchids that drew Miss Marple's attention. It was the bench at the far end, where a section of the wooden floor seemed slightly askew, as if recently disturbed. Craddock noticed it too, and knelt to examine the bench. With a gentle push, he revealed a hidden compartment beneath, its edges cunningly disguised by the grain of the wood. Inside were several small packets wrapped in oilcloth, their contents glinting faintly in the torchlight. He opened one carefully, and even Mrs. Redding, watching from the doorway, gasped. Diamonds, uncut, their facets rough but unmistakable, spilled into his hand, catching the light like tiny stars. "Smuggling," Craddock said, his voice grim, just as Crane's notes suggested. "These must be worth a fortune." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, her gaze drifting to Mrs. Redding, whose face had gone ashen. The woman swayed slightly, gripping the doorframe for support. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Lawrence never told me." Craddock stood, his expression sceptical but not unkind. "Mrs. Redding, you'll need to come with us to answer some questions. This changes things." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Perhaps, Inspector, you might allow Mrs. Redding a moment to compose herself. This is a shock, I'm sure." She turned to the younger woman, her eyes soft but searching. "My dear, if there's anything you wish to tell us, anything at all, now would be the time." Mrs. Redding's lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed she might speak. Then she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know about the diamonds," she said. "But Victor Crane, he came to me last week, asking about Edward Langley. He said he had proof I was involved in something from years ago. I told him it was nonsense, but he wouldn't stop. He threatened to ruin us unless I told him where the diamonds were hidden. I didn't even know they existed." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "And your husband? Did he know about Crane's threats?" Mrs. Redding hesitated, her hands twisting the shawl. "I told Lawrence, yes. He was furious, said he'd deal with Crane himself. But he didn't kill him, I swear. He left to protect me, to draw suspicion away. He thought if he was gone, the police would focus on him and leave me alone." Miss Marple listened, her expression unreadable. The story was plausible, but there was a note in Mrs. Redding's voice, a tremor of desperation, that suggested she was still holding something back. The photograph, Miss Marple thought, and the name E. Langley. They were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit neatly together. As the officers catalogued the diamonds, Miss Marple stepped outside, her eyes drawn once more to the willow tree. Its branches swayed gently, their tips brushing the earth near the spot where Crane's body had been found. She recalled the scratch on its trunk, the green paint on the shattered lantern, and the button she had found in the orchard. Each was a clue, small but insistent, like a misplaced stitch in a pattern. She approached the tree, her fingers tracing the scratch again. It was deeper than she'd realized, and nearby, half hidden by roots, was a faint indentation in the soil, as if something heavy had rested there briefly. She knelt, careful not to disturb the ground, and noticed a tiny fleck of green paint on a blade of grass, matching the smear on the lantern's glass. Her lips curved in a faint smile. The garden, she thought, was indeed speaking, if one knew how to listen. Craddock joined her, his notebook in hand. "Mrs. Redding's story checks out, in part," he said. "Crane's articles mention Langley using orchids to smuggle diamonds, hiding them in shipments of plants. It's possible Mrs. Redding was involved, even if she claims she wasn't. But the lack of footprints, that's still a puzzle, and Redding's disappearance doesn't help her case." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes still on the willow. "The footprints, Inspector, are not as mysterious as they seem. I believe the answer lies here in the garden. The willow tree, you see, is more than a subject for Mr. Redding's sketches. It's a witness of sorts." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed by now to her cryptic remarks. "A witness? You think the tree saw something?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but knowing. "Not saw, Inspector, but held. Look at those branches, low, strong, almost touching the ground. A clever person might use them to move without leaving a trace. And that scratch, it suggests something was dragged or perhaps swung in a hurry." Craddock frowned, following her gaze. "You're saying the killer used the tree to get to the greenhouse. That's a stretch, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," she said, her tone mild. "But the smallest details, Inspector, often tell the largest stories. I suggest you have your men examine the branches closely. You might find something illuminating." As she walked back to her cottage, the button in her pocket felt heavier, its engraved design a silent question. Mrs. Redding's confession had shed light on Crane's motives, but the murder itself remained unsolved. The green paint, the scratch, the lack of footprints, these were the garden's secrets, and Miss Marple was certain they pointed to someone closer to Willow Cottage than the missing Lawrence Redding. Old Tom, with his guarded manner, or perhaps another figure yet to emerge from the shadows of the past. In her parlour, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the lace shawl growing under her steady hands. The greenhouse had yielded its treasure, but the truth, she knew, was still hidden, waiting in the silent embrace of the willow tree, and she, with her quiet persistence, would coax it into the light. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of deepening blues, the first stars pricking through as the village settled into its quiet rhythm. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the fire casting a warm glow across the room. Her knitting needles paused as she contemplated the final threads of the mystery at Willow Cottage. The discovery of the diamonds in the greenhouse had shifted the case, but the absence of footprints, the green paint on the shattered lantern, and the scratched willow tree still held secrets that demanded unravelling. Lawrence Redding had been apprehended in London that afternoon, and Inspector Craddock had telephoned to arrange a gathering at the cottage to confront the suspects. Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, was invited to attend, her insight as vital as ever. By 7 o'clock, the drawing room at Willow Cottage was a scene of strained anticipation. Mrs. Redding sat by the window, her auburn hair loosely pinned, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea she had not touched. Lawrence Redding, pale and dishevelled from his time in hiding, sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the floor. Old Tom, the gardener, stood near the door, his weathered hands fidgeting with his cap, his expression a mix of defiance and unease. Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his notebook tucked away, his manner calm but authoritative. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, appeared as innocuous as a village spinster might. Her lace shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Craddock began, his voice steady. "We've made progress in the case of Victor Crane's murder," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "The diamonds in the greenhouse confirm what Crane's note suggested. A smuggling operation, likely tied to Edward Langley's old network. But the question remains, who killed Crane? And why? Mr. Redding, you've been in London, and your absence raised suspicions. Mrs. Redding, you've admitted to Crane's blackmail, and Tom, you were the last to see him alive. It's time for the truth." Mrs. Redding's cup rattled in its saucer, and Lawrence reached for her hand, his jaw tight. "I didn't kill him," he said, his voice low but firm. "I ran because I thought they'd blame me. Crane was hounding us, threatening to expose Clara's past. I thought if I drew attention away, she'd be safe." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was clear as she spoke. "And yet, Mr. Redding, you left behind a garden that saw more than you realised. The willow tree, I believe, has been the silent witness to this crime." All eyes turned to her, and she continued, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Victor Crane was killed not for what he knew, but for what he saw and what he might have revealed. The greenhouse held the diamonds, but the garden itself holds the truth." She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and addressed Craddock. "Inspector, you'll recall the lack of footprints in the mud by the greenhouse. It puzzled us all, didn't it? But the willow tree, with its low branches, offered a way to move without leaving a trace. A strong man, or a desperate one, could use those branches to swing to the greenhouse, avoiding the soft earth." Craddock's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "We found a rope fibre caught in the tree's bark, just as you suggested yesterday, and a smear of green paint on one of the branches, matching the lantern." Miss Marple's eyes turned to old Tom, who shifted uncomfortably. "Tom," she said softly, "you told me you saw Crane by the greenhouse that night, with his lantern. You told him to leave, but he didn't, did he? And you, loyal to the Reddings, knew more about that greenhouse than you let on." Tom's hands tightened on his cap, his face reddening. "I don't know what you're getting at, miss," he muttered. "I told the inspector all I saw." "I believe you did," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but unrelenting. "But you didn't tell us what you did. Crane was a threat, wasn't he? Not just to Mrs. Redding's past, but to the secret you'd helped keep. The diamonds hidden in the greenhouse. You've tended this garden for years, Tom, and you knew about the false compartment under the bench. Perhaps you even helped Mrs. Redding maintain it, out of loyalty." Mrs. Redding gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Miss Marple continued, her eyes fixed on Tom. "That night, you followed Crane to the greenhouse. He was trying to break in, wasn't he? With that lantern, looking for proof of the diamonds. You confronted him, and in a moment of panic, you struck him with a garden tool, a spade perhaps, from the shed nearby. The lantern fell, shattering, and you used the willow's branches to swing yourself to the greenhouse, leaving no footprints in the mud. The scratch on the tree was from your tool, or perhaps your belt, catching as you moved." Tom's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging. "It wasn't meant to happen," he said, his voice hoarse. "He was going to ruin them. Mrs. Redding, Mr. Redding, the whole lot. I only meant to scare him off, but he laughed. Said he'd have the police on us all. I swung the spade, didn't think. Next thing, he was down." Mrs. Redding's eyes widened, tears spilling over. "Tom, you didn't... for us." Tom nodded, his gaze on the floor. "Been with this garden since afore you came, ma'am. Couldn't let it all fall apart. Them diamonds. I knew they was trouble, but you said they was your way out, a new start. I kept quiet, did what I could." Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "Tom, you'll need to come with us. Loyalty's no excuse for murder." As the constable led Tom away, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Redding, her expression gentle but probing. "My dear, you didn't know what Tom did. But you knew about the diamonds, didn't you? And Edward Langley. He was more than an acquaintance, I think. Mrs. Redding's shoulders shook and she nodded, her voice barely audible. He was my fiancé years ago. The diamonds were his, hidden before he disappeared. I thought I could use them to start over with Lawrence, but Crane found out. I never meant for anyone to die. Lawrence squeezed her hand, his face a mix of relief and sorrow. It's over now, Clara, he said. We'll face it together. Miss Marple returned to her cottage as the stars brightened above, her mind at ease, but her heart heavy. The willow tree had indeed been the silent witness, its branches concealing a desperate act of loyalty. She resumed her knitting, the lace shawl nearly complete, and reflected on the frailty of human motives. The garden had spoken, and she had listened, as she always did. Chapter 8. The garden restored. The soft light of dawn crept over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of rose and gold. Miss Jane Marple stood in her garden, a pair of pruning shears in hand, carefully trimming the faded blooms from her roses. The air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of autumn, and the village was slowly returning to its familiar rhythm. The turmoil at Willow Cottage had settled, like dust after a storm, and the events of the past week seemed almost dreamlike in the quiet of the morning. Yet Miss Marple's mind, ever active, lingered on the case, tying up the final threads as neatly as she tied off a completed scarf. The arrest of old Tom had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, though not the kind that lingered long. Villagers, accustomed to the ebb and flow of gossip, had already begun to turn their attention to the upcoming harvest festival, their whispers about the murder giving way to debates over jam recipes and flower arrangements. Tom's confession had closed the case. His desperate act to protect the Reddings, driven by a loyalty rooted in years of tending their garden, had led to Victor Crane's death. The diamonds, now in police custody, had confirmed the smuggling link to Edward Langley, and Mrs. Redding, though not charged with murder, faced questions about her role in concealing the illicit gems. Miss Marple paused, her shears snipping a wilted petal, and glanced toward Willow Cottage, just visible beyond the hedge. The Reddings had announced their departure the previous evening, their belongings packed into a hired van bound for London. Clara Redding, her auburn hair hidden under a scarf, had been seen leaving with Lawrence, their faces drawn, but their hands clasped tightly. They were to face charges for possession of the smuggled diamonds, but Miss Marple suspected their true punishment was the loss of the quiet life they had hoped to build in St. Mary Mead. The cottage stood empty now, its garden untended, the greenhouse door still ajar, its secrets laid bare. She returned to her pruning, her thoughts drifting to the willow tree that had played so pivotal a role. Its branches, heavy with the weight of Tom's desperate act, had concealed the truth until her patient observation had brought it to light. The scratch on its trunk, the green paint on the lantern, the rope fibre caught in the bark, each had been a whisper from the garden, and Miss Marple, with her knack for listening, had heard them all. She recalled a similar case in the village years ago, when a young man's secret meetings in a barn had been betrayed by a broken fence post. Gardens, she thought, were like people. They held their secrets close, but they always left clues for those who looked. Inspector Craddock had stopped by her cottage the previous night, his manner a mix of gratitude and bemusement. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he'd said, accepting a cup of tea. "That business with the willow tree, I'd never have thought of it. How do you do it?" She had smiled, her eyes twinkling. "It's only a matter of noticing, Inspector. People and gardens are not so different. They both tell stories if you know where to look." He had laughed, shaking his head. "Well, we've got Tom in custody, and the diamonds are secure. Mrs. Redding's cooperating, and Redding himself seems more relieved than anything. I suppose it's as tidy an ending as we could hope for." "Tidy," Miss Marple had murmured, but not without its sadness. Loyalty, you know, can be a heavy burden. Now, as she clipped another rose, she reflected on that sadness. Old Tom, with his weathered hands and quiet devotion, had acted out of a misguided sense of duty, believing he was protecting the Reddings from ruin. Clara Redding, haunted by her past with Edward Langley, had carried the weight of the diamonds, hoping they would secure her future. And Lawrence, fleeing to shield his wife, had only deepened the suspicion around him. Each had been caught in a web of their own making, and the garden, with its silent willow, had borne witness to their unravelling. Miss Marple set down her shears and brushed her hands on her apron, her gaze drifting to the sky. The church clock chimed 8, its notes clear in the still air, and she thought of the photograph in the Reddings' parlour, now packed away with their belongings. It had been Edward Langley, she was certain, standing beside a younger Clara, his face half hidden but his presence a shadow over the entire affair. Crane's pursuit of that shadow had cost him his life, but it had also exposed the truth, as truth always seemed to do in the end. She returned to her cottage, settling into her armchair with a fresh ball of wool. The lace shawl she had been knitting was complete, folded neatly on the table, and she began a new project, her needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. The village would move on, she knew, its scandals fading like the roses she had pruned. But Miss Marple would not forget. The garden at Willow Cottage, with its locked greenhouse and whispering willow, had told its story, and she had listened, as she always did. As she worked, her eyes drifted to the window, where the first leaves of autumn were beginning to fall. People forget, she murmured to herself, that nature too has eyes. And with a satisfied nod, she turned her attention to the new pattern, the village's secrets safe for now in her quiet hands.